When people hear top 10% net worth, the first reaction is usually the same. That's not for someone like me. It's for people who started earlier, took bigger risks, or live in a completely different world. Once that idea settles in, something quiet but important happens. The number stops influencing real decisions. Debt feels less dangerous. Spending doesn't get questioned. Progress isn't tracked because the goal already feels out of reach. When a target feels impossible, it stops shaping behavior. Here's the part most people miss. The top 10% doesn't feel impossible because it's rare or extreme. It feels impossible because it gets mentally dismissed before it ever has a chance to matter. The moment a number becomes abstract, it loses its ability to guide choices. I'm Alex. Today we'll look at why the top 10% feels so distant, what that number actually represents, and how many households reach it without doing anything dramatic. If this way of thinking helps you see your own financial progress more clearly, staying with the series will make sense. It starts by understanding that the top 10% isn't a type of person or a stroke of luck. It's a number, and most people misunderstand it from the very beginning. What the top 10% number actually is, the top 10% of net worth in the US isn't a mystery club or a private list. It's a statistical cutoff. According to census-based estimates, that line sits around $1.8 million in household net worth. Not income, not cash, net worth. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Net worth is simply what you own, minus what you owe. It includes home equity retirement accounts, taxable investments, savings, and sometimes a business or rental property. It does not mean you have $1. 8 million sitting in a checking account ready to spend. Here's where people misfire. When they hear that number, they picture liquidity stocks. They can sell tomorrow. Cash they can wire instantly. That picture is wrong. In reality, a large share of that net worth is often locked up. A home bought in 2010 for $320,000 that's now worth $650,000. A 401k built slowly with 6 to 10% contributions over 25 years. Assets that grow quietly while life looks ordinary. This is why the number feels unrealistic at first glance. The headline sounds extreme, but the structure behind it isn't. It's less about striking it rich and more about time consistency and ownership. Once you see that contrast, the number stops feeling abstract and starts feeling measurable. Households versus individuals. That $1.8 million figure applies to households and not individuals. And that single detail quietly changes the entire conversation. A household might be one person, but more often, it's two adults. Sometimes with kids, sometimes with a parent living under the same roof. In the US, the average household is about 2.5 people, which means that number is spread across shared income, shared assets, and shared responsibilities. This is where a lot of self-comparison goes wrong. Someone earning alone looks at $1.8 million and measures it against their own bank account, their own 401k, their own progress. That's holding yourself to a standard the data was never designed for. You're comparing a solo snapshot to a combined picture. Mentally reframing helps. If you split that household number in half, you land closer to $900,000 per adult. Still a serious amount of money, but no longer mythical. It's the kind of number many professionals approach in their 40s or 50s through a paid-down, home-steady retirement contributions and time. And here's the quiet twist. Even at that level, life often looks normal. Same commute, same grocery store, same neighborhood. The wealth is real, but it's shared gradual and mostly invisible. Once you adjust for that context, the goal stops feeling distant and starts feeling oddly familiar. Why wealth at this level looks invisible. Drive through a typical middle to upper middle class neighborhood in the US. Not a gated community, not a struggling area, just a normal place with decent schools and well-kept lawns. Statistically, about 1 in 10 households on that street is already in the top 10% by net worth. You wouldn't know which one. There's no sign in the yard, no obvious upgrade that gives it away. The cars are often 5 or 6 years old. The house looks similar to the others nearby. Vacations look normal, maybe a road trip, maybe one flight a year. This is where expectations break. People assume wealth announces itself. In reality, it usually blends in. That's because net worth doesn't show up in daily spending. It builds quietly in places you don't see when you drive by. Equity that grows as a mortgage balance shrinks. Retirement accounts that compound while contributions stay boring and automatic. Assets that don't change how someone orders dinner or shops for groceries. There's a contrast most people miss. Flashy lifestyles are usually funded by income and debt. Quiet wealth is usually funded by time and ownership. One looks impressive up close, the other only shows up on paper. This is why so many people underestimate how common this level of wealth actually is. They're looking for signals that rarely exist. By the time wealth becomes obvious, it's often no longer stable. How that net worth is typically structured. Most households in the top 10% don't have one giant account doing all the work. Their net worth is spread out, built piece by piece over time. A large share usually sits in home equity, a house bought years ago for $400,000 that's now worth $750,000 with a much smaller remaining mortgage. That equity didn't come from a lucky bet. It came from time monthly payments and a long stretch of appreciation that felt boring while it was happening. Then there are retirement accounts, a 401k with steady 6 to 10% contributions, matched by an employer invested through market cycles. Over 20 or 25 years, that alone can grow into $500,000 or more without any dramatic moves. Most people underestimate how powerful consistency looks when you finally add it up. On top of that, there's usually a smaller layer of flexible assets, a taxable brokerage account, cash savings, maybe $150,000 to $300,000 combined. Not enough to change lifestyle overnight, but enough to add resilience. Some households also have a rental property or a small business they built gradually. Many don't. The common thread isn't complexity. It's diversification through time, not through cleverness. The structure looks plain until you total it up. Why people still don't feel wealthy at one point, $8 million. Crossing the top 10% line doesn't suddenly change how life feels. For many households, day-to-day routines look almost exactly the same the month before and the month after. That's because a big portion of that net worth is illiquid. Home equity doesn't pay for groceries. A 401k balance doesn't make a vacation feel cheaper. Even a six-figure brokerage account often sits untouched because selling it would mean taxes or long-term trade-offs. The money is real, but it's not flowing. Here's the quiet disconnect. Wealth at this level shows up as stability, not indulgence. The mortgage feels manageable. Unexpected medical bills don't trigger panic. A job change feels possible instead of terrifying. Those are upgrades you don't see on Instagram. In fact, many households at this level deliberately avoid looking wealthy. They drive paid-off cars. They live in homes they bought years ago, not upgraded ones. Their spending didn't rise at the same speed as their assets. That restraint is part of why the net worth grew in the first place. So when people imagine $1.8 million as yachts and luxury, they're picturing a lifestyle funded by spending. This number mostly represents options, not extravagance. And that difference explains why so many people reach it without ever feeling rich. How people actually reach the top 10%. Most households that end up in the top 10% didn't do anything extraordinary. They made reasonably good decisions and repeated them long enough for the math to work. They didn't pick perfect investments. Many bought the wrong car once. Some sold a stock too early. Others waited too long to refinance or missed a hot trend entirely. None of that mattered much. What mattered is that those mistakes didn't force a reset. Progress usually looks like this: steady employment, regular contributions to retirement accounts, buying a home they could afford instead of stretching for the maximum approval, letting raises improve savings before improving lifestyle. Over 20 or 30 years, that pattern compounds quietly. There's a contrast people overlook. One bold decision rarely builds lasting wealth, but one avoidable disaster can erase decades of it. That's why consistency beats brilliance here. Even timing, which people obsess over, turns out to be secondary. Someone who invested steadily through multiple market cycles often ends up ahead of someone who waited for the right moment. Time in the system matters more than precision. This path isn't exciting. It doesn't make good headlines, but it's reliable. And reliability over long periods is what moves households into the top 10% without them ever noticing the exact moment it happened. The role of risk and landmines. Risk is unavoidable if you want to build wealth. Investing is a risk. Buying a home is a risk. Even changing jobs carries uncertainty. The difference isn't whether risk exists, it's how much damage it can do if things go wrong. Households that stall out usually don't fail slowly. They hit landmines. A heavily leveraged business that doesn't work and leaves personal guarantees behind. Repeated car upgrades financed at high rates that lock in years of payments. A lifestyle that expands faster than income and never contracts. One of the biggest resets comes from poorly managed personal events. a divorce that turns into a long legal fight, two households becoming one, then suddenly becoming two again, with higher fixed costs on both sides. Years of steady progress can disappear in a short window. Good risks slow you down when they fail. Bad risks force you to rebuild. That's the line people in the top 10% tend to respect instinctively. They'll invest in the market but avoid betting everything on one idea. They'll grow income but keep obligations manageable. This isn't about fear, it's about survivability. Staying in the game long enough is what allows compounding to work. Most people don't lose because they were wrong. They lose because they couldn't absorb the hit. The real pattern behind top 10% households. When you zoom out and look across households that reach the top 10%, a pattern shows up that isn't flashy, but it's consistent. They stayed employed or employable, not always in the same job, but in roles where skills stayed relevant. When layoffs happened, they could re-enter the workforce without starting from zero. That continuity matters more than salary spikes. They kept fixed costs under control. Housing, car subscriptions, and long-term obligations didn't consume every raise. Many could have upgraded sooner. They chose not to. That decision quietly widened the gap between what they earned and what they spent. They also avoided decisions that permanently knocked them off track. No repeated bailouts for failing ventures, no stacking of high-interest debt during good years, no financial moves that required everything to go right just to stay afloat. Here's the subtle part. These households often look conservative from the outside, but over decades, restraint acts like leverage in reverse. It reduces drag, it creates margin, and margin absorbs shocks. This is why restraint often beats aggression, not because it's smarter, but because it's harder to undo. Wealth builds when progress doesn't get erased. The top 10% isn't defined by bold moves, it's defined by durability. Why net worth alone is a weak signal? Net worth looks precise, but it hides more than it reveals. Two households can have the same number and live in completely different financial realities. One might have a high net worth on paper, but almost no margin. A large house with a heavy mortgage. Retirement accounts they can't touch. Fixed expenses that leave little room if income dips. On the surface, the number looks strong. Underneath, it's fragile. Another household might show a lower net worth, but feel far more stable. Modest housing costs. Little or no consumer debt. Cash reserves that cover surprises without stress. When the car needs a major repair or a medical bill shows up, it's annoying but not destabilizing. That difference shows up fastest during disruption. A job loss, a recession, a health issue. One household adjusts, the other panics. Net worth didn't predict that outcome. Structure did. This is why resilience matters more than rank. Can expenses flex if income changes? Is there breathing room between obligations and earnings? Can decisions be made without everything hinging on the next paycheck? Those answers tell you far more about financial health than a percentile ever will. Net worth is a snapshot. Resilience is a system. And only one of them determines how well you sleep at night. Momentum versus static snapshots. Net worth percentiles freeze people in time. They tell you where someone stands today, but nothing about how they got there or where they're headed next. Two households can both sit at $900,000. One is moving up quickly, the other is sliding backward. The number looks identical, but the momentum is completely different. One has rising savings, shrinking debt, and assets starting to carry weight. The other is relying on overtime selling investments to cover expenses, or slowly adding debt to maintain appearances. This is why so many people feel behind when they aren't. They're comparing their early or middle chapters to someone else's late chapter. Net worth doesn't show age timing or trajectory. A 38-year-old with growing assets and controlled expenses is often in a stronger position than a 55-year-old with a higher number but no margin. Momentum shows up in subtle ways. Are assets contributing meaningfully yet? Or is progress still coming only from work? Does time feel like an ally or a threat? Do small setbacks slow progress or reverse it? Percentiles don't answer those questions. Direction does. And direction is what determines whether today's number becomes tomorrow's stability or quietly evaporates. The quiet reality of the top 10%. 90% of households never cross the top 10% threshold, and many of the ones that do never experience a dramatic moment where everything feels different. For most, the shift is quiet. Bills stop creating tension. Emergency expenses don't derail plans. Decisions get made with a little more patience. Life doesn't suddenly look luxurious, it just feels steadier. That's why this level of wealth is so often misunderstood. It doesn't show up as excess, it shows up as absent. Less financial urgency, fewer forced choices, fewer nights spent worrying about timing or cash flow. Another overlooked detail is that reaching this level doesn't lock anything in. A household can drift out of the top 10% just as easily as it drifts in. Markets move, expenses rise, personal events happen. The number isn't a finish line, it's a snapshot. What matters more is what got built along the way. Systems that can absorb shocks, habits that don't rely on constant income growth, a structure that doesn't collapse when conditions change. That's the quiet truth. The top 10% isn't defined by luxury or status. It's defined by stability over time, and that stability is usually invisible to everyone except the people living inside it. Key takeaways. Reaching the top 10% isn't about crossing a dramatic finish line. It's about quietly building a structure that holds up over time. The number itself is less important than what sits behind it, how assets are spread, how expenses behave under pressure, and how much margin exists when life shifts. What separates progress from frustration isn't brilliance or timing, it's durable. Avoiding decisions that force a reset matters more than chasing the perfect opportunity. Stability compounds just as reliably as money does. Net worth snapshots can distort reality. They hide momentum risk and resilience. Direction matters more than rank. A system that absorbs shocks adapts to change and doesn't rely on constant effort creates freedom long before it creates luxury. If this way of thinking reframes how you judge progress, stay with the series. The most important patterns are rarely obvious, but once you see them, they're